they'd talk about how it felt to feel like they were finally here and finally had freedom. And I was watching, these images of the airport and felt like there's no symbol of arrival. Like there really
Mm.
has to be a symbol of arrival. And I kind of put it together that, this 2,000 miles wasn't necessarily supposed to be just, wow, look at how long it is, but really, what can you do with it? And wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to create a form of a symbol where someone could give something to someone else to show welcome? So that's really kind of like it all kind of came together in that way. And the idea of a blanket is, often when someone comes into the world, they're often given a present of a welcome blanket. And, obviously, refugees who are coming to this country have had full lives before. Many of them are adults, but it's also welcome to a new world. Like, this is your new home. It's probably really different from where you came from. And we're really happy you're here and you made it. So that's where it comes from. So it's a little bit of a long story, but it just kind of brews with what happens in the world and sort of how to kind of reimagine how things could actually be.
Mm.
And I love that it's all these different people who are really representing sort of who they are in these blankets. And we're also, for whoever's listening, with these blankets, we're asking the makers to include notes about a story important to their family, about immigration, migration, or relocation, and words of welcome. And, maybe for you, Kelly, definitely for me, reading those notes is one of the most wonderful things to sort of take part in and sort of witness all these, different stories of when people came and, people finding out about their family's history through this project. And this idea of sharing, and that we all, have had experiences of being move from one place to another, whether it's, ourselves or our ancestors. And so it's really nice to put us all in the context of welcome. Like, we are all this big mishmash of people. One, one group is clearly here, before everyone else, but also they have a huge history of being relocated and having to go through migrations. And, that is its own story. So it's this really, I really love this project because it's really durational. There's the opportunity to really have conversations about these really complicated topics. And having it be at the Smart Museum of the University of Chicago, that also means that we're able to really work with the community in Chicago for a lot of these conversations, and also sort of host a lot of dialogue around immigration and refugees. And I think that that's really exciting because I feel like in this day and age, we're not always talking in full sentences, like often in 140 characters. And I think that this is a project that really kind of slows that down. And the people who are making them all together are often, working in groups. Like, people work by themselves, they work in groups, but there's often conversations around immigration that happen that might not if someone wasn't working on this project.
Yeah, I was at the Smart Museum yesterday. There was a group of middle schoolers who came to help unpack the blankets.
Mm-hmm.
And so John had asked me to come because he wanted a couple of adults who were experienced with this
Mm-hmm.
to help the
Thank you.
process. And before we started the unpacking, he had them sort of line up in a line and said, okay, I'm going to ask you some questions. And depending on sort of where you fall in the continuum here, you can sort of go to this side or this side.
Mm-hmm.
And so he asked questions like, America should close its borders, or we're a nation of immigrants. And people sort of went to one side or the other. And it was so interesting to me to have those sort of really adult conversations with middle school children.
Interesting. And how, like, when they were doing this, were people on both sides, or was this?
Yeah, yeah, they were moving back and forth. And they were so the first question was, it's important for America to close its borders, and a lot of them were sort of in the middle, and I was all the way to the no, open the borders to everybody
Mhm.
side of things. But we so it was lining up in sort of those to one side or the other, but then also he would ask them, why did you choose to stand there? And they had these really thoughtful, interesting responses. And they had thought about their own family's immigration history. And I think one of them was himself an immigrant, and, a lot of them had parents or grandparents who were immigrants. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was just really exciting to see that sort of conversation with middle school students.
Yeah, I went with Allison Gass, who's the director of the Smart Museum, and we did a Q&A over at the lab school with mostly third and fourth graders, and they ask the best questions.
Mm.
Like really, like it's it's really amazing how engaged kids are, and I feel like kids are often underestimated in terms of sort of how complex they might see the world, or how sort of how engaged they really are. And I love that there are kids who are all different ages who are coming into this exhibition, because it really does give them a chance to talk about these things. And I love that idea of going back and forth and kind of visually seeing where sort of how people are feeling.
Yeah, well, and it's a neat exhibit for kids because you can actually touch the blankets.
Mm-hmm.
It's so rare that, you go into an art museum and you're allowed to touch any of the art. So I think that part's really cool. Anyone who's been on the Welcome Blanket Instagram page, of course, knows my children have been in the exhibit a ton.
Absolutely. And then when I was there last weekend, there was another school group there, and one of the little girls said to another, as she was like wrapping herself in a blanket, she said, "Oh, I love this place. I just want to stay here forever." And my heart almost burst. Like it was definitely not for anyone else, in that room, but just that idea of being able to create a space, particularly within a museum, that really feels welcoming, because a museum is really a space for the community, or at least in my mind, it should be. And I think the Smart is really good at really like embodying that ethos. And so it's really exciting to see people actually use it that way. It's a thrill.
It's the best place to knit. I love knitting in that space. And I am going to cry when that exhibit comes down and I don't have that space to knit in anymore. I also don't know what I'm going to do with my Saturdays.
We'll come up with something.
I'm sure. So I had a couple of other things that I thought maybe we could just sort of have a conversation about. One of those is something that came up. We had a whole episode about sort of art and politics and the relationship between the two. And there was a question of, if you are sort of a political activist yourself and you're an artist, how important is it that your art be political? So the two projects that we've been discussing have been sort of explicitly political.
Mm-hmm.
But, I imagine that there could be a point in your life where you don't want every project you do to be quite so explicitly political. And, so how important is that? This past Saturday, you were in a dialogue with Allison Gass and Judy Chicago, and I was struck by how much of Judy Chicago's work is explicitly political.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about, to what extent is that part of her identity as an artist? To what extent would it almost seem antithetical if she did a project that was not so explicitly political? And so sort of teasing out those issues and, what does it mean to be sort of a political artist, and how does that affect the work that you do going forward?
I think that's a really good question. These two projects happened because they had to happen. And there was something inside of me, and continues to be, that just keeps pushing them forward. Because they're not the easiest, they're not the easiest projects to undertake. But I think we're all complex people. So I think a mix of I think of mix of things that might be overt, things that aren't. I think that's okay. I don't think we as people are necessarily full, clear brands. Like, this is exactly what I do all the time. And I feel like the work that I create has always sort of built on each other. When I talk with people, particularly in architecture, I say, this is an architecture project, and often it doesn't present that way to other people immediately. And so I think my work really has to do with creating spaces and looking at the ways that people do interact and can interact, and sort of a I think that's sort of the basis. And I think these projects are really looking at like how do you create the world you want to see? Like how do you craft that? So I think the mediums can change, but I think, you could say everything we do is a political choice. Like, did you walk or do you drive to work? Like, like what's the environmental impact? Sort of that kind of thing. So I think work over time kind of shifts. And I think a lot of times work that people create comes from sort of like inside of them and things that they're interested in. So doing work on color theory in itself could be implicitly very political, without it necessarily being like the impetus to start it. So I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but I think maybe a quick way is that, everything's a little bit more complex than sometimes we give it credit, like kind of give it credit for.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of funny because like scale is a big one too. Like
Right.
sort of like what sort of what you do. And I was talking with someone who's like, is everything you do going to be big? And like, I don't think so. Like I think it's important to kind of look at different scales and how they work. And I think it's important for artists to not be boxed in the expectation of, what they should be doing because of what they've done before. I think it's sort of like a building and learning investigative process.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned scale because so these are such large projects, but yet they are not commercially large, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So, this is an enormous project with 2,000 miles of yarn, but you can't sell it.
True. That someone told me I should, and my response was, these thousands of people have been making these for other people specifically. I think that goes against the integrity of the project itself, but one day maybe we'll create an auction for something else. It's so I have one of my in my previous life I worked at a startup that was kind of like Pokemon Go before Pokemon Go, and we ran out of funding. It was really expensive to make, and it was during the recession, and our angel investors looked at their checkbooks or their bank accounts and decided to not write us a check. So I think from that I've really looked at sort of what could I be able to do on a large scale on a shoestring, and sort of how can people contribute in that way, and figuring out ways for people to individually kind of give what they can. I mean, you've made all these blankets. Like that is so much time. Like when you think about sort of the contribution each person is giving, and if they're buying new yarn versus what's in their stash or what was given to them, everyone, they actually are financially like, not not inexpensive with all the hand labor, but yeah, they're a different kind of scale. And I think what's sort of exciting about this time that we live in is that we can disseminate this information and people can choose to participate if they want to. And this is a great way to be able to do it. So it's kind of like a modern, like barn raising, really. Like we're all building this together with a diagram of how to do it. And I think that's why it's really viable.
Yeah, and we hear so much about sort of how terrible social media is right now and how it's led to this like downfall of our society, and that that's why we have such polarization. But I think that projects like this show you the true value of social media. That I mean, how could you couldn't do a project like this without social media. You couldn't do a project like, especially like the Pussy Hat Project, without things like Facebook
Mm-hmm.
and Instagram and Twitter, and like this is how and Ravelry, of course.
Of course.
And these are how we can disseminate that information. I mean, my support